안녕하십니까. 오늘도 이렇게 이른 아침에 많이 나와주셔서 대단히 감사합니다. Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much again for joining us this morning. This morning we have very special guest speaker who will share his very valuable insights on Trump administration's economic and trade policy. Trade policy toward Asia in particular. Of course, Asia includes China and Korea. Mr. Charles Freeman is currently Senior Vice President for Asia at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. With his very, very unique and wide experience in government, business, and academia, and law, mostly involving Asian business and economic affairs, trade affairs, and therefore I'm sure he will enlighten us this morning from his very unique perspective, his valuable insights on particularly the current Trump administration's trade policies toward Asia, the looming conflict between China and the U.S. Fortunately, yesterday I'm sure you have learned from media that President Xi Jinping gave some positive reactions to President Trump's trade threat. Actually, two countries are so interdependent. I'm sure Mr. Freeman will share his valuable insights. There got to be some sort of compromise, hopefully. But in any case, it remains to be seen. Mr. Freeman, as I said, had a very wide and the unique experience in business and government and government both administrative branch and legislative branch, and the law and academia. But he served, in today's context, I mean our speech, the lecture context, very importantly, he served as Assistant U.S. Trade Representative, USTR, who was principal negotiator with China. And so I think he will share very insightful views this morning regarding this issue. And he is a non-resident fellow at the Brookings Institution, and he is an advisor to CSIS, and he is very closely involved in U.S. business academia as well, particularly policy making think tanks. And therefore, I'm very sure he's the best person who will enlighten us regarding U.S.-China trade relationship and implications for Korea, and impact U.S. trade policy toward Korea as well. I just gathered that his father was President Nixon's interpreter when President Nixon went to China in the 70s. So he speaks fluent Chinese, and he did postgraduate work at the Fudan University, and spent some time in Taipei to learn Mandarin Chinese. So or more, can I say he's the best person we have solved. Well, with no further ado, I would like to ask Dr. Song to proceed with this lecture. Okay, thank you very much. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Freeman.
Let me invite Charles Freeman to say what he has to say about today's topic. Would you like to take the podium, or would you like to sit here?
I have a bit of a bad back, so
sure.
it's easier if I sit.
Okay, the floor is all yours.
Thank you. I can't possibly follow that introduction. I am not worthy. But I do want to thank the Institute for welcoming me today, and for having my colleagues in today, and for a delicious breakfast, and for a chance to spend some time with you. I am 2 months into my role as Senior Vice President at the Chamber, focused on Asia. But hopefully I've picked up a few things over the years, so I won't entirely bore you today. I want to start by talking about U.S. trade policy broadly, what it is, what it isn't. President Trump brings a certain strand of American political reality to the trade show, as it were. But U.S. trade policy for 75 years has been kind of caught between two different competing strands. There's the idealistic strand after World War II, which recognized that the great conflict that led to World War I and continued in World War II was created by the inability of nations and economies to get along, to trade between one another peacefully. And so the idealistic thought was, from U.S. Policy leaders at the time, was, let's create a rules-based order that focuses on market liberalization, but that fundamentally tries to preserve an economic peace among nations. And that strain has been repeated throughout history, U.S. history. All negotiators, including the titans of recent trade policy years like Carla Hills and Charlene Barshevsky and Wendy Cutler, have all proceeded from the notion that there was a higher reason to be working on trade policy, that it wasn't simply about U.S. national interests, that it was more fundamentally about building this rules-based order in which orderly trade could continue. On the other hand, there has always been a very populist notion in U.S. trade policy and a desire to put America first. It goes way back. In fact, the original efforts by U.S. trade policymakers back after World War II to help create something called the International Trade Organization failed because the U.S. Congress refused to pass it for very populist notions of sovereignty and other things. So the kind of the put America first policy of the Trump administration, which is focusing on a more narrow definition of U.S. interests, has been there all along. So despite the fact that we think of Trump as being kind of a great disruptor, the reality is that he's part of a long trend, and the other trend, the return to a kind of more idealistic approach to international trade and the idea of creating a global rules-based order, still is there. There are plenty of people still working on these issues, and so I think that it's very likely, in my view, that there'll be a return to a much more orderly approach to trade over the years. That said, the issues that President Trump has raised are serious and genuine, particularly with China, but more broadly with respect to trade. Americans, particularly of a certain segment of the population, feel betrayed by American trade policy, feel that this idealistic approach to trade put Americans behind, put Americans second or third behind these lofty international goals. And therefore, really, that group of Americans really believes very strongly in the president's approach to trade, sort of a zero-sum approach. The U.S. Chamber, I should say, is more aligned with the internationalists and the sense of that U.S. policy should be primarily focused on building this rules-based order, because we think that that's where America wins. That actually is where is putting America first. That our companies are able to compete better in a global order that is more transparent, more rules-based, where governments have fewer opportunities to intercede in the markets. And so the U.S. Chamber will continue to push very hard on that front. We were against, for example, the tariffs under Section 232 on steel and aluminum. Not so much because we fail to recognize that there's a worldwide glut in these commodities, but because we don't think that the rationale for deploying tariffs, namely that a failure to protect U.S. steel is a failure to protect U.S. national security. The interjection of security issues into trade policy is very worrisome because it's a bit of a slippery slope. A trade policy that allows governments to invoke security, whether it's the question of steel or the question of cybersecurity, digital trade, really disrupts the global order significantly because it allows for a fundamental excuse from conducting a rules-based trade policy. So we're very against these policies. We were, of course, very pleased that once the Section 232 policies were announced, that it didn't take long for the Trump administration to recognize and grant Korea an exemption to those policies. That's as fitting if you're going to invoke security, you might as well exempt some of your best allies. And so we were very pleased that the exemptions went through on that. We're struggling a bit to understand why Japan is excluded from that exemption list when countries like Argentina and Brazil, Mexico, who are not allies, who are friends but not allies, were exempted. So there are contradictions in the trade policy that trouble us, and I think they're invoking this notion of security more for this populist approach to trade and an effort to protect some very vulnerable Americans in steel and aluminum producing parts of the country, but the way to go about it is not the way that we don't agree with the way they're going about that process. Similarly, with respect to China, the invocation of tariffs under Section 301 of U.S. trade law, which allows the president to take extraordinary unilateral measures in the face of essential unfairness, is very troublesome, because again, the invocation of unilateral sanctions or unilateral tariffs flies against this notion of trying to maintain a rules-based international trading system. If countries are able to invoke these kinds of emergency tariffs at will in the face of unfairness, it sort of makes the WTO an irrelevant institution. And many of us, including in the U.S. business community, including the Korean business community, have worked very, very hard to promote the existence and the smooth sailing, the smooth running of the WTO. So tossing the WTO aside by invoking unilateral tariffs is troublesome. I will say we are very sympathetic with the sentiments coming out of the White House with respect to China, notwithstanding that we don't agree with the invocation of tariffs. We think that at this point, China's economic policy is a fundamentally disruptive global challenge, not just to U.S. competitiveness in China, but to U.S. and other allies' competitiveness around the world. And I'll explain why. Essentially, and we did see this beginning with overcapacity in Chinese steel, but it's spread to other sectors. The Chinese government has a number of tools of state capitalism, state-directed capitalism, to promote particular industries. In steel, there was a command that went out from Beijing that building steel factories is good. that was taken up in the provinces and in the cities, and soon every province and every city seemed to want its own steel mill. Notwithstanding the fact that China has no natural competitive advantage in steel other than high volumes of coal, but they don't have the other raw materials necessary to produce steel, and steel fundamentally is not a labor-intensive production commodity. So China built 50% of the world's steel capacity with no natural competitive advantage, simply on the back of a combination of subsidies from the center and from the provinces, from this fiat that came down from Beijing that we want to be a world leader in steel. And as a result, even though you can quibble with the numbers and say, well, China, it actually consumes most of its steel, it exports very little, particularly to the United States. The reality is that with that kind of production, with that kind of overcapacity, the world's steel companies cannot compete in a fair and meaningful basis. So steel is one thing. But what we've seen as China has come up the value chain, as China's economy has grown so extraordinarily successful, is we've seen this kind of pattern replicated in other sectors. We saw it in fiber optic cable in the early 21st century. We saw it, we've seen it in solar panels and in wind turbines, where China is the enormous producer of these, with no real natural competitive advantage, but this combination of state subsidies, promotion by the center of this kind of production, and inability to kind of wind up and consolidate overcapacity. And we're seeing this again with China's new blueprint for avoiding the middle income trap, this blueprint that to be a world leader by 2025 in all sorts of new and modern and cutting edge sectors, whether it's artificial intelligence, whether it's life sciences, whether it's semiconductors. And the challenge for all of us is that we're all trying to get into these things and be as competitive as possible in these sectors. And if China produces essentially overcapacities, it does a number of things that are damaging to the global economy. Yes, if you're an installer of solar panels, you're very happy that the price of solar paneling is down. But if you're in semiconductors and you're a small producer of semiconductors, you put R&D, research and development money into producing semiconductors, so that semiconductors turn over, you can innovate to get that next generation 3 or 4 years in a cycle. If China comes in and collapses the technology cycle, the innovation cycle, it means that small and medium-sized enterprises, who ultimately are the primary employers of Americans and Koreans and others, those companies will have a very difficult time competing on the global stage. So we have the Intels of the world may be fine because they have the resources to compete in this market, but the smaller companies just won't, and that's a fundamental challenge. And so it's why I think, even though we disagree at the chamber with the tariffs on 301, the process by which China is innovating and China is developing these new industrial sectors really presents a fundamental challenge to the way we think about the global economy. And we'd like to find constructive ways to get through this. We do think that negotiation is the best way forward. But we've had negotiations for the last 15 years related to this issue or these issues, and we haven't had a lot of success. So we certainly can understand the frustration of the Trump administration at the current state of affairs. As was mentioned earlier, President Xi Jinping at the Boao Forum yesterday announced a series of proposed measures to open the market, and these are great. This is important. Whether or not President Trump can and should take a victory lap that he forced the Chinese leader to make concessions, I'm not sure. particularly since all of these promises by Xi Jinping have been made before, and they haven't always been implemented on a timely basis. We think all of the things that he's announced are very important. We welcome them. We're cautiously optimistic, and we're very hopeful. But it still doesn't change the fundamental challenge that China presents to global competitiveness as a result of its current economic structure. I guess I'll stop there and open for questions if I can, now that I've been a little provocative. Thank you.
Let me make a quick announcement before I open the floor for questions and answers. I'll do it in Korean for the audience's sake. 오늘 여러분들께서 아실 수도 있겠지만 저희가 이제부터는 차세대 우리 차세대 리더들도 좀 육성하는 차원에서 이 앞에 헤드 테이블에도 이 차세대 리더로 클 수 있을 가능성이 보이는 분들을 좀 자리 배치를 했습니다. 그리고 이 차세대 리더가 되실 분들도 적극적으로 Q&A에 참여하시겠다는 의향을 밝히셨기 때문에 오늘부터는 뒤쪽에서도 많은 질문을 해주시기 바라겠습니다. Yeah. With that, I'd like to open the floor for questions and answers. 그리고 참고로 저희가 아주 훌륭한 통역이 있기 때문에 한국말로 질문을 하셔도 좋습니다. 그래서 적극적으로 질문 많이 해주시기 바랍니다.
While you're thinking of your questions, I got so focused on China, I forgot to talk about what's really important here, and that is, we were recognized that the U.S.-Korea FTA, the KORUS, is our gold standard. It's the best trade agreement that we have. We were absolutely delighted that USTR and the trade ministers were able to reach agreement to make sure that the renegotiation of the KORUS was effective and taken care of. We didn't think it needed that much renegotiation. We thought that yes, there are some critical implementation and enforcement questions related to the KORUS, but fundamentally we thought it was sound and didn't need to be reopened. And I'll say that as enthusiastic as we are about coming to a conclusion and coming to a closure on the KORUS, at least in principle, we were a little troubled by the terms that were negotiated by the U.S. administration. We were not keen on the raising of tariffs. That's just something we don't think is necessary or useful. And we were very troubled by, frankly, the institute of what are effectively the voluntary restraints on exports of Korean steel. That again it undermines the global trading system in our view. And although it's expedient and it answers to again that populist strain in U.S. economic policy, it's not good for business ultimately. I'll say, all that said, and recognizing the importance of the KORUS, there are other things that we should be doing together to advance the U.S.-Korea relationship, and frankly to advance the U.S.-Korea leadership of global trade around the world. And I'm thinking in particular of the importance of reaching new standards in digital trade. We're here right now with our colleagues and with a number of our companies under the Korea-U.S. Business Council working to advance the dialogue to make sure that they're increasingly in the same place on digital trade issues. There's obviously, in any time you're dealing with digital trade, there are interests of privacy and there are interests of expedience in the use of data. And Mr. Zuckerberg was testifying on Capitol Hill earlier this morning on these subjects. But we think that it's very important to make sure that we are maintaining as open borders as we can for data while protecting privacy, because as the OECD has done studies on, and WTO, restraints on data, particularly data localization efforts, the efforts to maintain data within borders for security reasons, ostensibly, is twice, it costs essentially around $100 billion a year in business losses, and is effectively twice as restrictive as tariffs. So, as we think about the importance of privacy, we also want to think that there's an economic cost here, and so being overly restrictive isn't good for anybody. So I guess I'll leave it there, and I probably will think of something else. But in the interim, let me ask for comment.
Mr. Freeman, you said that you were disturbed by the fact that the political considerations is entering this trade policy. But in effect, the U.S. free trade agreements from the very beginning was all really more motivated by the political, security, and geopolitical considerations than economics, starting out with the Jordan. And I think, of course, U.S. Chamber was very helpful when we did the quotas. I was also sideways involved, and I saw much of the considerations of Congress was also driven by the fact that Korea was an important ally. Now, Donald Trump is a very atypical president, and of course, he does and says things in a very coarse ways. But you seem to be caught in between, criticizing some of the ways he was doing it, but also applauding some of the end purposes, such as controlling China's practices. And that's very much like Trump's policies. One thing Trump said is that he will consider the friends and exempt them from some of those harsh measures. And in so doing, he is not showing too much friendliness to Korea. And do you think it is, to some extent, in the Washington's considerations of current Korean administration, not being really a friend to the United States?
I think the administration actually really views Korea as a genuine partner and ally. I think the president, his methodologies may be challenging and difficult to understand for those of us who are deep state Republicans like myself. But I think at the end of the day, there's a recognition of how important the U.S.-Korea relationship is within the administration. I mean, the president has talked about a lot of things, whether it's the need for allies to spend more to preserve U.S. troops and that kinds of things. But I think at the end of the day, he recognizes that Korea is an invaluable friend in the region, and I hope he maintains that belief.
Yes, in the back.
Mr. Freeman, thank you for your lecture in early morning. Can I ask you in Korean? 저는 어제 보아 포럼에서 시진핑 주석이 이제 얘기했던 것들에 조금 더 구체적으로 문의해보고 싶은데요. 어제 조치를 이제 얘기했던 것 중에 지적재산권을 조금 더 강화하겠다라는 조치가 있었고, 그다음에 자동차 관세를 조금 더 낮추겠다 이런 내용들을 발표를 했었는데, 시진핑 주석이 이런 조치들을 내놓은 이유에 대해서 한번 좀 들어보고 싶고요. 이후에 그럼 트럼프 대통령은 과연 어떤 식의 반응을 내놓을지 생각하시는 바 있으시다면 말씀 부탁드리겠습니다.
Well, President Trump has already reacted on Twitter, and he was very pleased, and he took a little credit for President Xi's remarks and for Xi reducing tariffs on autos and things like that. The reality is that tariffs on autos have been going down pretty consistently in China for a long time, and the U.S. doesn't actually export a lot of autos there or here, frankly. Most U.S. automobiles produced in China are produced, or excuse me, most U.S. automobiles sold in China, and there are quite a few that are sold there, are produced in China on 50-50 joint ventures. I think it would be more interesting, frankly, than reducing tariffs on autos if China reduced the equity caps on U.S. ownership of automobile production and a lot of other areas. Chinese investment restrictions continue to be a much more significant challenge, we think, than tariffs alone. Investment restrictions, some other administrative burdens on exports and on U.S. investment in China are the real story in terms of market access considerations. So we welcome greater protections of intellectual property, but for those of us who have been negotiating with the Chinese since for 20 years or so, we've heard these promises before. So I'm delighted if this results in increased protection for intellectual property, but if I'm optimistic, I'm only cautiously so.
Yes. Any other questions?
Okay, I have a short question. I think that basically the current problem is the problem between China and the United States. As you mentioned, basically China will not pursue the intention of the U.S. They are not, when you think about the long history of China, they're not pursuing the international rule-based order. They are pursuing some kind of flexing their muscles. So basically, I'd like to know, what is your prospects of the future of the trade dispute between the U.S.-China? Will it be contained in a smooth way or moderate way, or will it be aggravated? Which is your opinion?
I think we're due for a bit of a skirmish for a while. I don't think it will be smooth. Ultimately, though, I think it will require that resolving the central challenge posed by China will require that like-minded allies and friends and economies that recognize the challenge that China presents get together and create some architecture that helps keep the challenges that emanate from China within their guardrails. And I think there are some within the Trump administration that are pursuing that approach, that are trying to work with allies and friends to develop a kind of multilateral approach to the China challenge. I'm not sure that those people, those officials, were all that pleased that the opening salvo of Trump's approach to trade was Section 232, which really angered a lot of friends and allies by its approach. So I am hopeful that we'll get back to a more moderate approach to trade, and that the U.S. and China can continue to have what is ultimately a very productive relationship, notwithstanding the challenges. We have had a very complementary trade relationship, and a lot of our members are doing quite well in China. Not as well as we think they could be, but they're doing quite well. So we want to continue to protect the market and open the market for the Chinese market for our membership. We hope that the Trump administration focuses on that as much as the challenges to a narrow segment of the American population. But none of this is going to be easy.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Freeman. And my name is Dae-jung, and I work at the Finance Ministry and in charge of trade matter. And also, we've been in Washington in the last month for the renegotiation of, FTA. And,
Congratulations.
Well, thank you. Well, thank you. I'd like to begin by thanking you for the strong and the big advocate of the economic relationship as well as the cross FTA between the two countries. And I have two questions, and one is about the prospect. And it recently is there is a high. What we have witnessed is Trump administration would like to link with the trade matter with other politics, other international relation, and other security matter. And even after the initial agreement on the cross FTA, he immediately after respond that he would like to wait until the North Korea dialogues and summit, and also. And you see, this is a lot of the measure he took was rather than the trade, but also on the security and other. So how likely that he like to connect and make linkage between the trade and other matter in the future? And also another thing we haven't noticed is like talk is a bilateral matter rather than the multilateral framework, and it's a start from Korea, and they're talking on the NAFTA. But even after 7 to 8 rounds of talk, there's not much progress. So I heard they like to talk with directly with Mexico and Canada bilateral matter, and also even the Japan would like to the U.S. to re-enter the TPP. And the U.S. stand is they want to talk directly with Japan, and same is true for the China. So how do you see that this is shift or the trend? The U.S. trade policy, they want to do it more on the bilateral matter rather than the multilateral, and also they want to still continuously link with other matter. And number two question is Trade Expansion Act on 232, which is on the steel and aluminum, and 201, which is on the solar panel and washer, and 301 on the intellectual property. And I have a feeling that a lot of this list it came from the industry, and including the U.S. chambers. And do you have any other list of the grievance or content you have submitted to the Trump administration so that we could be prepared?
Let me try to answer your first question. In terms of trying to speculate on what President Trump will do in terms of linkage with non-trade matters, I wake up every morning and read the Twitter feed, and I'm as surprised as anybody else. So I'm not going to try to guess on where he will go. He does like to put things together and see what happens, and I think some of it is just to try to get a reaction. But I think he's been very successful over the years with that style in his business. So he's seen some success in his presidency with that. In terms of the bilateral, the president, this is the thing that troubles those of us who are trade policy wonks. Is the president's approach on bilateral seems to be driven by this notion that bilateral trade deficits or surpluses are bad or good, and that's how you measure a relative strength or success in trade relations. Any student of macroeconomics 101 knows that bilateral trade deficits or surpluses mean essentially nothing, and not only because of the way that trade data is captured, but because they don't reflect the broad, the broad trade issue. I have a trade deficit when I go to 7-Eleven and buy a Coca-Cola. I have a trade deficit with them, but I don't expect them to buy my services. So the fact that we have a trade deficit with Korea or with some others is natural to a certain extent. In terms of I think that's what drives the bilateral approach. I do think that at some point, we certainly at the Chamber would support the United States returning to TPP. We were disappointed when the President withdrew. We would like to come back. I'm not sure at this point that there are any active, new FTA negotiations on the table. You hear rumors of the Philippines. You hear rumors that we'd like to do something with Japan, but I don't think Japan is particularly interested right now. in terms of your second question, you know, the U.S. Chamber has grievances is probably too strong a word. We have concerns about implementation and enforcement of KORUS and other agreements with Korea. And our members are anxious to do business here and to be successful here for, we think, perfectly reasonable and benign reasons. And in some cases, we think that the restrictions on their ability to do business here are unfair and not good for Korea. We don't submit a whole lot of things to the USTR or to Commerce that says, you know, we think that imports of washing machines or other things are too much. That's not really our business. We're much more focused on opening markets rather than keeping our markets closed.
Okay, now a question from one of your counterparts in Korea, Korea International Trade Association.
한국무역협회 정희철입니다. 뉘앙스 전달을 위해서 영어로 질문하는 점을 양해 바랍니다. Mr. Freeman, I'm from Korea International Trade Association. I admire your insight and I also admire your family legacy. Next week, we will be sending a small economic delegation to Washington. It's consisted of a number of CEOs. We're not going to negotiate or argue anything. It's a friendly outreach effort to stress the importance of unceasing economic cooperation between the two countries. All schedules are set. We even have an event with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce.
Thank you.
Nevertheless, may I ask for your last-minute advice on what we should do, say, or emphasize? Thank you.
It really depends on the audience. You know, I think there are some, you know, when you talk to Capitol Hill, you want to stress the investment and the employment in the United States. When you talk to our companies, you want to talk about the cooperation and the closeness of the partnership between businesses. And when you talk to USTR or others, you want to talk about how much more open the Korean market is going to be to all sorts of exports and investment from the United States. You know, we're looking forward to having you on Tuesday, and are thrilled at the relationship and the partnership we have with Kita. So keep doing what you're doing, and if we can be helpful at all to Kita or any of our friends in the associations, we are delighted to do it. We think we have a strong relationship with our Korean counterparts, and so we're there for you.
Okay, Barbara from the Korea German Chamber of Commerce.
Thank you. The issues that have been portrayed here with regards to China for Korea and for the United States is of course the same also for Europe. So my question is, as Europe is the other big bloc in this sense, in what way are the United States and Europe teaming up on solving this?
It's a really good question. And I think, you know, we have to do a better job reaching out to our counterparts in Berlin and in Paris and the UK. Is the UK still part of Europe? And as well as in Tokyo and Seoul and others. And you know, we've kind of let our government do that in the past, be the run point on those kinds of conversations. We really need to do a better job as businesses to make sure that not just our governments or individual governments are hearing from us, but that there is a greater consensus among businesses across Europe and the United States and Japan and Korea. So yeah, no, if you've got a hotline to someone I can call in the BDI or others, I'm happy to make the call.
We have a liaison office in Washington.
Okay, I know.
Yes.
Thank you. This is kind of a fundamental, basic economic theory issue, because after international financial crisis, more than $10 trillion has been put into the market, especially FRB, $4 trillion. Now economy is coming back, almost to full employment in the United States. And then Trump asking more countries invest into the USA, and then import more goods from USA, and then reduce our export to USA. And also reducing tax rate, spending more money, infrastructure, military spending. They all become the increased aggregate demand, which means you need to import more goods from abroad. So your deficit, trade deficit issues cannot be solved. Then I'm afraid Trump will continue use the power, pressure, to ask Korea or other countries to import more. Well, what is your forecast in coming years?
I think I think we all know that the way to reduce a trade or a current account deficit is to increase savings and reduce consumption. Our fiscal deficits are a challenge. We are very supportive of the tax cut. We think it's necessary. There was a lot of uncertainty in the American business community before that so there had been a lot of cash built up that needed to be spent. We think that the tax cut is good for wages and for workers, and it's important that we reduce the pressures on working Americans. I think the president in his trade policy is really trying to benefit and help the Americans that have been kind of left behind by globalization. And I think on a basic level, he's just very sympathetic to that community. So I think his trade policy reflects that sympathy more than it does hard economics. And we can argue about whether that's an appropriate way to conduct economic policy through emotion, but it's certainly proven to be a powerful political tool, and I think the president has sensed the appreciation from that community of Americans for his leadership.
So are you saying his chances of being re-elected is getting higher?
I have no idea.
Okay, I understand we have a couple of questions in the back. One from Samsung Research Institute. I understand she has a question about the Indo-Pacific Initiative.
Okay, thank you for sharing a chance to, give a question in this precious occasions. And I'm Eugene An from Samsung Economic Research Institute, and thank you for your very insightful lecture. And since I've studied in India, and you mentioned strategic alliance with multinational approaches. So recently there's Indo-Pacific strategies from U.S. and Japan and side. So I just wonder what's your view on this kind of strategies upcoming, and successful point of this kind of strategy will be.
It's a very good question. I think for a lot of years, really since the late 20th century, there has been an interest and an effort to draw India greater into East Asia, U.S. Circles. The idea being in part that as a democracy, that India understands and knows where we're coming from on a lot of our policy issues, but more fundamentally, it's isolating India from the rest of the architecture of Asia, the rest of the trading architecture of Asia, didn't make a lot of sense. So I think there is a desire to increase that kind of participation, as well as a strategic focus on drawing India as a potential counterweight to China. I think that's some of the thinking that goes there. U.S.-India relations are still very new in many ways, and we're still feeling our way with that relationship. Modi has been a good friend to the United States, but as we all know, Indian politics can be very dynamic. Let's say that. So who knows what will happen in the coming future.
Any other questions? While the audience is preparing their own questions, let me. Oh, there is.
예, 안녕하십니까. 저는 서울경제신문의 기자 박형윤인데요. 다름이 아니고 미국과 중국의 그 무역 분쟁이 벌어지고 있는데 이 트럼프 행정부가 바라보고 있는 우리 한국 정부의 그 스탠스가 과연 미국 정부는 좀 바람직하다고 생각을 하고 있는지, 또 이제 부회장님이 만약 한국 정부라면, 한국 정부의 한 관계자라면 미국과 중국의 이런 그 분쟁 갈등 속에서 좀 어떤 그 스탠스를 취하고 싶으신지, 예, 좀 이런 점을 여쭙고 싶습니다.
I think there's a parable I've been told about 4 or 5 times since coming to Seoul 3 days ago about the 2 whales and the shrimp, and I think my response would be, what if I was an administrator? I'd probably get out of the way. That said, the United States and Korea share a lot of fundamental interests. We all know that Korea and China have a lot of fundamental economic interests as well. I don't think those are contradictory. The United States has enormous investments and trade relations with China, and most of those most of that is a good news story. So despite the background noise and the challenges that are being raised in the press, we have hundreds of thousands of Americans living in China, working in China. We have hundreds of thousands of Chinese doing the same in the United States. We'll get through this. We still have too much interconnectedness and too much at stake in each other's success to let this fundamentally drive us apart. If we come into conflict, it's in many respects it's a result, I think, a mistake rather than a design. So I think the challenge that both Beijing and Washington have is managing the disputes carefully so that they don't get out of hand, and making sure that we're communicating as well as we can with our friends and partners in the region, including here in Seoul, so that everyone understands what we're doing. It's a little hard to have that kind of communication flow when you don't have all of your ambassadors or other senior officials in place to make sure that those communications between the United States and Seoul and other parts of the world are smooth. But we're hoping that situation is cleared up quickly. We have enormous confidence in the Charge d'Affaires, Mr. Napper, here, but we certainly would like to see a formal ambassador confirmed as quickly as possible. I've answered all the questions.
Sorry to come back a second time. A specific question. It was said the U.S. consideration of the tariff against the Korean steel is the fact that Korean steel contains too much of Chinese components. Now, Korea claims that it's very, very small part. Has the U.S. Chamber looked at this issue, and have you studied which side is telling the true story?
We have not studied the issue. We read what you do. We know that there's a very small amount of Chinese steel that actually makes its way into the United States, whether through Korea or other places. The issue, I think, that the Trump administration is concerned about is not the actual quantity of Chinese steel that makes it into the United States. It's the depressive price on the global markets of overcapacity. So I think that's the focus and that's the challenge.
I don't quite belong to the next generation, but let me ask a question anyway. I think you are a little bit optimistic in the sense that despite this conflict between China and the US, despite this conflict between state capitalism and industrial policy versus market economy, there's a lot of complementarity so that you can work it out. But there's another view that all this trade conflict is a part of the big picture when there is a fundamental conflict between the reigning superpower and the rising superpower, so-called Thucydides trap, so that even if this storm blows over, there will be another thing keep coming up, whether it's over Taiwan, North Korea, or whatever area. This is a fundamental conflict so that you cannot be optimistic and hope that all these things can be resolved by negotiations. When you look at the history, before the Second World War, you know that Great Britain was the largest trade partner with Germany, and still we have the Second World War. So what do you think about that kind of view?
You know, I recognize the attractiveness of the Thucydides trap argument, and I certainly is something to watch for. All I'll say is, you know, in 1972, when my dad went to China, there were still effigies of Uncle Sam being burnt in classrooms throughout China. We, as you well know, we had an active war with China that was very bloody. You know, in the past, you know, nearly it's almost 50 years, we haven't had a hot war with China. That's a pretty good record, considering that you can think of the fundamental philosophical and political differences that we have. The U.S. business community has played a huge part in maintaining ballast in the relationship so that we haven't come to blows. And if I'm optimistic, it's that I think the U.S. and Chinese business communities still have that potential and that power to maintain close relationships and stable relations, notwithstanding the political challenges that are out there. I also will say that neither U.S. nor China is a static power. We have Donald Trump, who may represent some fundamental change in U.S. Political trajectory. You have Xi Jinping, who may represent some fundamental change in U.S. Political history. But a friend of mine used to quote this story about reading the trends and reading statistics. And that is when Elvis Presley, some of you remember Elvis Presley, when he died in, I think, 1977, 1 in 20 million Americans listed their profession as Elvis impersonators. 20 years later, 1 in 300,000 Americans listed their profession as Elvis administrators. If the trend had continued, 1 in 5 Americans would be an Elvis impersonator today. So I'm always nervous about reading too much into trends.
네, 저 연합 영문뉴스 최경희 기자인데요. 그 회장님께 질문이 있는데, 예, 오늘 주제와 관계가 있다고 생각합니다. 미국 대표 기업인 GM이 한국에서 생산 설비를 많이 가지고 있는데요. 다음 달까지 그 4개의 공장 중에서 하나를 문을 닫을 예정이고, 그리고 낮은 생산성과 고비용 때문에 그 노조와 지금 많은 갈등을 빚고 있어요. 그래서 10년 전부터 벌써 한국에서 나간다 안 나간다 이런 얘기들이 많았었고, 최근에 굉장히 그 갈등이 극대화되는 모습을 보이고 있는데요. 지금 청와대 근처에서도 매일 아침 GM 노동자들이 한국 GM 노동자들이 와서 농성을 하고 있습니다. 지금 이 상황을 회장님께서는 이렇게 갈등이 격화될 경우에 생산성이 낮고 GM에 도움이 되지 않을 경우에 한국에서도 철수하는 것이 맞다고 보시는지 이 이슈에 대해서 좀 의견을 듣고 싶습니다.
GM is a valuable member of the U.S. Chamber, and I'll let them speak for themselves on this kind of matter. But thanks for the question.
Any other? In the back, from the press, I think.
네, 한국경제신문의 성수영입니다. 크게 보면은 이게 통상과 관계가 있는 환율 관련된 질문인데요. 미국 정부가 계속 환율 관련해서 한국 정부에 이제 환율 개입을 자제하라고 압박을 넣고 있는데 이제 FTA와 연결이 됐다는 얘기도 나오고 있고 이것에 대해서 미국 상공회의소의 입장이 궁금합니다.
We do recognize that manipulation of currency can impact trade flows, and therefore we strongly oppose currency manipulation. As a general matter, though, we don't get too involved in currency dispute issues. We'll leave that to the Treasury Department and the Ministry of Finance here to discuss. Certainly, I will say that this has not been a huge topic among our members. So we haven't had the real pressure to get involved. Good.
Yeah, another one from the press.
Hello, I'm Hanbin Yu, a journalist working for 조선일보 Weekly Biz. Thank you for sharing your insights. I have one question. Since the production networks has been highly globalized, I guess the trade barriers put by the U.S. government might hurt the American businesses in China as well. So I'm wondering what kind of plans does the USCC has to deal with this issue?
It's a good question. We're thinking about it. We've had some inquiries from our membership about the process of seeking exceptions to the tariffs for because of critical inputs into items produced in the United States. But I think as a general matter, the effort on behalf of USTR and others who constructed the tariffs were to reduce the impact on American businesses and consumers as much as possible. So while we're still assessing the situation, and certainly will be very helpful to our membership to the extent that they feel they'd like our help to submit requests for exceptions, but we haven't come to that point yet.
Any other? Well, since you mentioned the importance of digital trade and your intention to promote digital trade with Korea as well as with other countries, I'd like to hear your view, personal view about the European Union's General Data Protection Regulation, which is to take into effect, in fact, next month. Will it?
We hate it. No.
Why?
No, I mean, I think the U.S. and Europe have come from very different places on the issue of privacy, and we understand why European sentiments about privacy are as strong as they are, and where that deep-set European sensibility about privacy comes from. The United States has a slightly different mindset, which may be historical, may be based in the way we conduct our laws. I mean, we're largely a common law jurisdiction. Europeans largely a civil code jurisdiction. So we come at it from different places, and I think, it also may be simply that U.S. companies have been very quick to get ahead of the trend or get ahead of the curve on the use of data as a business driver, to the point where now I think every company, whether they're European or the or U.S. or Korean, is a data company, regardless of which sector you're in. So I think as a general matter, we'd like to make sure that the needs of business in whatever privacy structure that is created are given at least a fair shake, and that we not over protect privacy when it's not required. Is that all right, Nick? Nick and Dan are our data gurus, and so.
Yeah, I come from foreign ministry. I just some observation from the start of the U.S. New administration, I mean the Trump administration. I participated in that many G20 meetings and APEC meetings, I mean that the multilateral forums. I observed that the U.S. position on multilateralism right now is fading. So I thought that it's not good for U.S. if that the U.S. administration do not emphasize on that multilateralism, but still new U.S. administration emphasize on that bilateral things. So I don't know that for the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, that position may be good for the U.S. Chamber or maybe not. So I just want to know that about that U.S. current position on that multilateralism from your view. And second one is data privacy. I don't know which one is right or false. You emphasize that the free movement of the data between the countries, but some people like me very worried about that my data just go over the beyond that my borders. I just talking about my personal thought, but still some U.S. companies, in particular, you know that the Facebook and they are dealing with that many personal data. So you know that recently we have some accident from Facebook. I don't know which one is exact or not, but anyway, that in that case that we think that still we need the more regulation on that data flow between countries. But how you can explain to that normal person like me, data free flow data is good for the world business or for the good for the well-being of the global citizen? Okay.
Thank you. That's a provocative question. With respect to multilateralism versus bilateralism, the U.S. Chamber fundamentally believes in multilateral approaches. We support the WTO. We support global institutions like that. Transparency, foreseeability, these are things that American businesses count very heavily on when they're doing business in overseas markets. So without multilateralism, chaos may be too strong a word, but it's a less safe world out there. In terms of a safe world for data, personal data, absolutely one can understand the need to protect privacy, the need to protect personal data, and particularly when you have very sensational examples where of breaches where personal data was compromised. You know, we're still in a very new part of how we deal with data. This is only this is less than a decade old between where companies started valuing and understanding the importance of data as an analytical tool to drive public policy issues, to drive business issues to drive efficiency issues. I think that the way to think about it, though, is what exactly is personal data? What do you really need to protect? Do you really need to protect the number of your insurance policy? Is that really a personal data issue? Why shouldn't that be allowed to go across borders? Well, I mean, should you really need? Do you really need to protect certain emissions issues that come out of your car as you're driving? You know, does Hyundai's does the fact that Hyundai's cars are being driven around the streets of Omaha, Nebraska, and the information from those cars is being back to Seoul, is that personal data that needs to be protected? We need to house that data in the United States? Does Korea need to house the data of an insurance company here? Ultimately, in terms of the use of data as an analytical tool and to do all the good it can, you know, for healthcare, for all of these, for crop distribution, for all of these things, you have to have the largest pools of data possible. It's one thing for China, which has 1.3 billion people, to draw a big circle around and walls around it and say, okay, we're going to keep all this data. It's another thing for Korea with a smaller population, or even the United States with a small population, to say, okay, we're going to just hold on to our own data for its own purposes. That really reduces the ability of that data to be used in productive, positive ways. We're still working, obviously, companies are still working on maintaining the best possible means of protecting data, personal or otherwise, the best way to anonymize data. We're still in the opening parts of this story, but I think, you know, from the beginning, saying, okay, this is too dangerous to allow out of the box is really I think would miss a huge opportunity, and frankly would cost us in the long run versus economies that have the ability to corral large pools of data for their own purposes.
Any other questions from the press?
Thank you very much.
No more? There is.
네, 저는 뉴시스의 김지은이라고 합니다. 한국말로 여쭤볼게요. 제가 아까 이해를 못한 걸 수도 있는데 미중 무역 분쟁 관련해서 아까 어떻게 또 진행되고 양국 간에 어떤 수준에서 타협이 될 거라고 보시는지 견해가 있으시면 궁금하고요. 또 미중 분쟁으로 인해서 한국의 영향이 미미하다라는 분석이 많은데 부회장님은 어떻게 보시는지 궁금합니다.
Its impact on Korea. You know, I think at the end of the day, I mean, just speaking for the U.S. Chamber, we really don't want there to be a point at which Koreans need to decide whether to trust the United States or trust China as a custodian of its economic future. We believe that the United States and China can work out our differences in ways which don't impact our other trading partners. That said, I think, you know, there are times when Chinese economic practices do damage to Korean interests, and at that time, those times, you know, the U.S.-Korea relationship provides some sort of vehicle to make sure that you're insulated from those challenges. So, you know, the U.S. Chamber is not in favor of a very, very aggressive tariff-driven policy towards China. We are in favor of building means for China to be less disruptive in global markets, and we think that effort, when and as it takes shape, benefits Koreans as much as Americans.
Well, I think it's about time to close. We're taking much advantage of your presence here. Let's end by asking you more provoking question, since you know China better than most Americans or most American experts as well. You know, Newsweek some time ago rightly pointed out, and which I would think you would fully agree with, the fact that Chinese people are most strategic thinking people in the world. And they are more long-term oriented people. They think things in terms of not just days and months they think in terms of decades or half a century or century. On the other hand, Americans and Europeans tend to think more in terms of short-term time span, days and weeks and months. Now, Xi Jinping during the 19th Communist Party meeting, had a very specific time schedule of China's future development. By 2050, China will not only be a prosperous country, but very, very powerful country in a military sense as well. Now, given this, I think the U.S. Business leaders and persons like you, experience in both government and the business and academia, are concerned about the lack of U.S. More strategic thinking, particularly in dealing with China. Ambassador He just mentioned Thukydides' trap, but to avoid that trap, U.S. needs more long-term thinking and long-term strategic the approaches to deal with China. And so in that context, for example, TPP, or now called TPP or whatever, Chamber of Commerce, wouldn't U.S. Chamber of Commerce strongly recommend U.S. government to join the CPTPP? And actually, someone mentioned the Australia, U.S. The strategic network and so forth. So, don't you think it is time for U.S. intellectual leaders to make American people and leaders to think more in strategic terms in dealing with China, because China is there, and China will get stronger and stronger and more assertive. So so I'm just interested in your views on this issue.
One of the things that we all have to remember is that for most of human history, China was over 30% of global GDP. Right. Its natural position is to be one of the strongest players in the world. I think the United States policy for the past 50 years, strategic or otherwise, has taken note of that fact and recognized that we couldn't exclude and we couldn't keep China from that kind of major position in world affairs, but rather we would try to build equities for China in the U.S.-led global architecture in ways that made China what Bob Zoellick used to call a responsible stakeholder. Right now, China does not look as responsible a stakeholder as we would like them to be. You know, they do have a long-term view. They are a strategic, very strategic people. There's also Chinese history is fraught with strategies being overturned by events, internal domestic events. And I'm not convinced that we've seen the end of history for China. You know, I do think that it would be wonderful if the U.S. had a more kind of consistent, intellectually driven strategy towards China, towards Asia, towards the world. We're living in anti-intellectual times in the United States right now. Expertise is frowned upon. So those of us that used to pretend we have expertise just stop doing that these days. I just want to close with one just observation about, you raised this notion of China as having this long-term view. There's a frequent, there's a conversation that's frequently cited between Nixon or it's actually between Nixon and Zhou Enlai, the former premier of China, as a demonstration of how long and strategic the Chinese are. And Nixon asked Zhou Enlai, you know, what do you think the lessons of the French Revolution are? And Zhou Enlai famously said, it's too early to tell. And Americans went, wow, 200 years, it's too early to tell. My dad was in the room. The Chinese interpreter told Zhou Enlai, there were some student riots on the streets of Paris happening right then. That's what the interpreter talked to Zhou Enlai about. He was asking, he thought the question was, what do you think about the student riots currently happening on the streets of Paris? Zhou Enlai said it's too early to tell. And from that, we think the Chinese have a long-term view. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for ending this very interactive discussion with that light joke. And purely out of curiosity, before we let you go, release you from sitting too long here, do you at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce look at the North Korean economy as well?
No, we don't. We're very member-driven, and we don't have a lot of members that have extensive investments in the North.
Thank you. With that, I'd like to end this very interesting forum this morning.
Okay. Thank you very much again. And I suppose we can go on all day today with you, but we have to end here. Thank you very much for sharing with us your very, very insightful views and the knowledge, particularly regarding this region. So I really appreciate for your giving us this opportunity. Actually, when I heard you're coming to Seoul, I immediately thought you'd be the best speaker. So I invited you, and I'm very glad we did that. And Dr. Song got that information, so we took a full advantage of that. Well, anyway, so please join me in thanking him and for his excellent presentation. And by the way, next week we'll have the Guy Sormang from France, and actually he will provide us the European view of China and in the global context. Well, with this, please join me in thanking again Mr. Freeman. Okay, thank you.